Welcome to From the Quarries. I really was surprised by this little book. The Dionysian Artificers was written by Hippolyto da Costa in 1820, and in it he attempts to prove that modern Freemasonry derived from ancient Greek philosophical and religious ideas. It's absolutely fascinating. A bit of background: Hippolyto da Costa lived from 1774 to 1823. He was a Brazilian journalist, author, Freemason and world traveller. He was actually imprisoned for being a Freemason by the Inquisition in Portugal in 1802. He escaped in 1805, settled in London, and wrote a 2-volume book about his experiences. He returned to Brazil and is today known as the founder of the Brazilian press. There's an awful lot in this work, so I've decided to divide it into 2 videos. The first section, the introduction, gives some background to da Costa's theories, but the second half looks at the close relationships between the history of the Dionysian cults and their relationship to Freemasonry. I really hope you enjoy it. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation, From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. The mysteries of the ancients and the associations in which their doctrines were taught have hardly been considered in modern times, but with a view to decry and ridicule them. The systems of ancient mythology have been treated as monstrous absurdities, debasing the human reason, conducting to idolatry and favouring depravity of manners. However, they deserve attention if the motives of their inventors, rather than the profligacy and ignorance of their corruptors, be contemplated. When men were deprived of the light of revelation, those who formed systems of morality to guide their fellow creatures, according to the dictates of improved reason, deserved the thanks of mankind, however deficient those systems might be, or time may have altered them. Respect, not derision, ought to attend the efforts of those good men, though their labours might have proved unavailing. In this point of view must be considered an association traced to the most remote antiquity and preserved through numberless vicissitudes, yet retaining the original marks of its foundation, scope, and tenets. It appears that, at a very early period, some contemplative men were desirous of deducing from the observation of nature moral rules for the conduct of mankind. Astronomy was the science selected for this purpose. Architecture was afterwards called in aid of this system, and its followers formed a society or sect which will be the subject of this inquiry. The continuity of this system will be found sometimes broken, a natural effect of conflicting theories, of the alteration of manners and of change of circumstances, but it will make its appearance at differing periods, and the same truth will be seen constantly. The importance of calculating with precision the seasons of the year to regulate agricultural pursuits, navigation, and other necessary avocations in life must have made the science of astronomy an object of great care in the government of all civilized nations. And the prediction of eclipses and other phenomena must have obtained for the learned in this science such respect and veneration from the ignorant multitude as to render it extremely useful to legislators in framing laws for regulating the moral conduct of their people. The laws of nature and the moral rules deducted from them were explained in allegorical histories, which we call fables, and those allegorical histories were impressed in the memory by symbolical ceremonies, denominated mysteries, and which, though afterwards misunderstood and misapplied, contain systems of the most profound the most sublime and the most useful theory of philosophy. Amongst those mysteries are peculiarly remarkable the Eleusinian. Dionysus, Bacchus, Osiris, Adonis, Thammuz, Apollo, etc. were names adopted in various languages and in several countries to designate the divinity, who is the object of those ceremonies. And it is generally admitted that the sun was meant by these several denominations. Let us begin with a fact, not disputed, that in these ceremonies a death and resurrection was represented, and that the interval between death and resurrection was sometimes 3 days, sometimes 15 days. Now, by the concurrent testimony of all ancient authors, the deities called Osiris, Adonis, Bacchus, etc. were names given to, or types representing the sun, considered in different situations and contemplated under various points of view. Therefore, these symbolic representations, which describe the sun as dead, that is to say hidden for 3 days under the horizon, must have originated in a climate where the sun, when in the lower hemisphere, is at a certain season of the year concealed for 3 days from the view of the inhabitants. Such a climate is in fact to be found as far north as latitude 66 degrees, and it is reasonable to conclude that from people living near the polar circle, the worship of the sun with such ceremonies must have originated, and some have supposed that these people were the Atlantides. The worship of the sun is generally traced to Mithraic rites and those invented by the Magi of Persia. But if the sun could be made an object of veneration, if the preservation of fire could be thought deserving of religious ceremonies, it is more natural that it should be with a people living in a frozen clime to whom the sun is the greatest comfort, and whose absence under the horizon for 3 days is a deplorable event, and whose appearance above the horizon is a source of real joy. Not so in Persia, where the sun is never hidden for 3 days together under the horizon, and where its piercing rays are so far from being a source of pleasure that to be screened from them, to enjoy cool shades, is one of those comforts, to obtain which all the ingenuity of art is exerted. The worship, therefore, of the sun and the keeping of sacred fires must have been a foreign introduction into Persia. The conjecture is strengthened by some important facts, which, referring to astronomical illusions, place the scene out of Persia, though the theory is found there. In the Boon Dehesh, we find that the longest day of the summer is equal to the 2 shortest of the winter, and that the longest night in the winter is equal to the 2 shortest nights in summer. This circumstance can only take place at a latitude of 49 degrees 20 minutes, where the longest day of the year is of 16 hours 10 minutes and the shortest 8 hours 5 minutes. This latitude is far beyond the limits of Persia, where history places Zoroaster, to whom the sacred doctrines of the Persian book Boon Dehesh are attributed. This proportion, then, of days and nights, as a general rule, could only be true in Scythia, whether the sources be the Irtish, the Obi, the Janiski, or the Slinger. We know nothing of the ancient history of those Scythians or the Massagetes, but we know that they disputed their antiquity with the Egyptians, and that the above principle, though attributed to the Persian Zoroaster, is only applicable to the country of those Scythians. But let the origin of the mysteries of the sun begin where it may. They were celebrated in Greece, in various places, amongst others at Apollonia, a city dedicated to Apollo and situated in latitude 41 degrees 22 minutes. In this latitude, the longest day has 15 hours, differing 3 hours from the length of the day when the sun is on the equinoxial. The reverse is the case with the nights. This circumstance will account for the preservation of 3 days in these mysteries, even when celebrated in Greece, and also for the 15 days or representation of the number of 15 in some Eleusinian rites. The mysterious numbers were employed to designate such and similar operations of nature, for it is said that the Pythagorean symbols and secrets were borrowed from the Orphic or Eleusinian rites, and that they consisted in the study of the sciences and useful arts, united with theology and ethics, and were communicated in ciphers and symbols. Similar intimations as to the mystic import of numbers are found in many other authors. The letters representing the numbers formed Kabbalistic names expressive of the essential qualities of those things they meant to represent. And even the Greeks, when they translated foreign names, whose Kabbalistic import they knew, so they rendered them by Greek letters, as to preserve the same interpretation in numbers, which we find exemplified in the name Nile. But in the number 3, to which so many mystical and moral allusions were made, had a reference to the 3 celestial circles, 2 of which the sun touches, passing over the 3rd in its annual course. The mysteries of Eleusis, the same as those of Dionysus or Bacchus, were supposed by some to have been introduced into Greece by Orpheus. They may have come there from Egypt, but Egypt may have received them at a previous period from the Persians, and these again from the Scythians, but taking them only as we find them in Greece, we will give here an outline of their ceremonies. The aspirant for these mysteries was not admitted a candidate until he had arrived at a certain age, and particular persons were appointed to examine and prepare him for the rites of initiation. Those whose conduct was found irregular, or had been guilty of atrocious crimes, were rejected. Those found worthy of admittance were then instructed by significant symbols in the principles of society. At the ceremony of admission into these mysteries, the candidate was first shown into a dark room, called the mystical chapel. There, certain questions were put to him. When introduced, the holy book was brought forward from between 2 pillars or stones. He was rewarded by the vision. A multitude of extraordinary lights were presented to him, some of which are worthy of particular remark. He stood on a sheepskin. The person opposite was called the revealer of sacred things, and he was also clothed in a sheepskin or with a veil of purple, and on his right shoulder a mule skin spotted or variegated, representing the rays of the sun and stars. At a certain distance stood the torchbearer, who represented the sun, and beside the altar was a third person who represented the moon. Thus we perceive that over those assemblies presided 3 persons, in different employments, and we may remark that in the government of the caravans in the eastern countries, 3 persons also direct them, although there are 5 principal officers, besides the 3 mathematicians. Those 3 persons are the commander-in-chief, who rules all, the captain of the march, who has the ruling power as long as the caravan moves, and the captain of the rest, or refreshment, who assumes the government as soon as the caravan stops to refresh. Some authors have observed the same division of power in the march of the Israelites through the wilderness, and consider Moses as the captain general, Joshua as the captain of the march, and perhaps Aaron as the captain of the rest. The society of which we are speaking was ruled by 3 persons with different duties assigned to them by a custom of the most remote antiquity. The mysteries, however, were not communicated at once, but by gradations, in 3 different parts. The business of the initiation, properly speaking, was divided into 5 sections, as we find in a passage of Theo, who compares philosophy to those mystic rites. These ceremonies, thus far, appear to contain the lesser mysteries, or the first and second stages of the candidate in his progress through the course of his initiations. There was, however, a third stage, when the candidate himself was made to symbolically approach death and then return to life. In this third stage of the ceremony, the candidate was stretched upon the couch to represent his death. As to the festivities in which these mysteries were celebrated, we find that on the 17th of the month of Athia, the images of Osiris were enclosed in a coffin or ark. On the 18th was the search, and on the 19th was the finding. Thus, in fables or symbolical histories relating to these mysteries, we find Adonis slain and resuscitated, the Syrian women weeping for Thammuz, etc. Let us now examine what was meant by this symbolical death and resurrection, or by certain personages said to have visited the Hades and returning up again. It appears that this type, in all its various forms and denominations, indicated the sun passing to the lower hemisphere and coming again to the upper. The Egyptians, who observed this worship of the sun under the name of Osiris, represented the sun in the figure of an old man, just before the winter solstice, and typified him by Serapis, having the constellation of Leo opposite to him, the serpent or hydra under him, the wolf on the east of the lion, and the dog on the west. This is the state of the southern hemisphere at midnight, about that period of the year. The same Egyptians represented the sun by the boy Hippocrates at the vernal equinox, and then was the festivity of the death, burial, and resurrection of Osiris, that is to say, the sun in the lower hemisphere just coming up and rising above the upper hemisphere. In this upper situation, the sun was called Horus, Mithras, etc., and hailed as Sol Invictus. We will now point out some other symbols to express the same phenomena, though different from those types we are treating of at present. In the Mithraical astronomical monuments, where the figure of a man is represented conquering and killing a bull, there are two figures by their sides with torches, one pointing downwards, the other upwards. These monuments, where the mysteries in question were depicted by the man killing and conquering the bull, represent the sun passing to the upper hemisphere through the sign of Taurus, which in that remote period, 4,600 years before our era, was the equinoxal sign. The two torchbearers, the one pointing his torch downwards, the other upwards, represent the sun passing down to the lower hemisphere and coming up again. At the remote time before alluded to, the sun entered the sign Taurus at the summer equinox, and the year was begun at this period among the Egyptian astronomers. Afterwards, in consequence of the precession of the equinoxes, the summer equinox took place in the sign of Aries. Hence, part of the Egyptians transferred their worship from the bull or calf to the ram, while others continued to worship the bull. We may explain this in the language of our modern astronomers by saying that some of the learned Egyptians continued to reckon by the movable zodiac, while others reckoned the year by the fixed zodiac, and this circumstance produced a division of sects in the people, as it was a division of opinion amongst the learned. Likewise, by the same precession of the equinoxes, the sun passed from Aries to Pisces in the vernal equinox, about 338 years before our era, yet the beginning of the year continued to be reckoned from Aries. If the Egyptian astronomy and Egyptian religion had then existed with the same vigour, both would have perhaps suffered a similar alteration. But the Egyptian systems were at that period nearly annihilated. We may observe, however, that the Christians, at the beginning of our era, marked their tombs with fishes as an emblem of Christianity, to distinguish their sepulchres from those of the heathens by a symbol unknown to them. Returning from this short digression to our immediate purpose, we have to observe that if those ceremonies and symbols were meant to represent the sun and the laws of its motions, these very phenomena of nature were studied with a moral view, as being themselves types or arguments to a more sublime or metaphysical philosophy, and the moral rules therefrom deducted were impressed on the memory by those lively images and representations. The emerging of the sun into the lower hemisphere and its returning was contemplated either as a proof or as a symbol of the immortality of the soul, one of the most important as well as the most sublime tenets of Platonic philosophy. The doctrines of the spirituality and immortality of the soul, explained by those symbols, were very little understood even by the initiated. Thus, we find some of them took those types to signify merely the present body, by their descriptions of the infernal abodes, whereas the true meaning of these mysteries inculcated the doctrine of a future state of the soul and future rewards and punishments, and that such were the doctrines of those philosophers is shown by many and indisputable authorities. The union of the soul with the body was considered as the death of the soul, its separation as the resurrection of the soul, and such ceremonies and types were intended to impress the doctrine of the immersion of the soul into matter, as is well attested. By the emblem of the sun descending into the lower hemisphere was also represented the soul of the man, who through ignorance and uncultivation was in a state compared to sleep, or almost dead, which mystery was intended to stimulate man to the learning of sciences. The Egyptians also considered matter as a species of mud or mire in which the soul was immerged, and in an ancient author we find a recapitulation of these theories in the same sense. The Persians, who followed the tenets of Zarathustra, called by the Greeks Zoroaster, having received the same doctrines upon the mystical contemplation of the sun, made also the same metaphysical application to the soul, the passage of the sun through the signs of the zodiac. The sun, moreover, was considered as the symbol of the active principle, whereas the moon and earth were symbols of the passive. The sun itself, considering its beneficial influence in the physical world, was chosen as the symbol of the deity, though afterwards taken by the vulgar as a deity. It must here be particularly observed that the different names which the Egyptians, from whom the Greeks learnt them, gave to God, instead of meaning several gods, were only expressions of the different productive effects of only one God, not very different from what the Jews came to derive from the great name Tetragrammaton.